Cyst-like odors lingered in the air, swirling between the rows of tightly packed houses on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. The stench clung to the walls of homes, seeped into clothing, and drifted through open windows like an unwelcome guest. It was a smell so potent, so inescapable, that the locals had long given up trying to ignore it. But nobody could have imagined what lay at its source. The complaints had been whispered for months. Residents had called the city, blaming the nearby sausage factory for the putrid air that burned their nostrils and turned their stomachs. The factory had even taken measures, cleaning its equipment, scrubbing every inch of its floors, and yet the smell persisted. It wasn't until one woman came running out of a house, naked, battered, and gasping for help, that the dark truth about Imperial Avenue began to reveal itself. This was not just another rundown neighborhood struggling with crime and hardship. This was a hunting ground, and inside one unassuming house, hidden in plain sight, was a secret so horrific that it would send shockwaves across the nation. Welcome to True Crime Watch HD. Before we dive in, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of our deep dives into the darkest corners of human nature. Now let's go back before the headlines, before the police tape, before the horror was known. The first whispers of unease started long before the world knew his name. Women, mothers, sisters, daughters were disappearing. Some were last seen walking alone at night. Others were known to frequent certain bars and street corners. But then, they vanished. For years, their absences barely made the news. Many of these women led difficult lives. Some struggled with addiction. Others were without stable housing. Some had minor criminal records. To the system, they were unreliable witnesses, transient, troubled. To their families, they were everything. Take Crystal Dozier, a mother of 7. She had her struggles, yes, but she never went this long without reaching out. Her mother, Florence Bray, was frantic. She reported her daughter missing, begged the police to investigate, but was met with indifference. "She'll turn up," they said. "She's probably off doing what she does." But Florence knew better. Then there was Tonya Carmichael, 52 years old, missing since the fall of 2008. Her family filed a missing persons report, but again, nothing. Her abandoned car was eventually found, yet no one connected the dots. One after another, women like Talacia Fortson, Michelle Mason, and Janice Webb disappeared into thin air. Some families put up missing persons flyers, but those posters had a way of mysteriously disappearing. It was as if someone wanted these women to be forgotten. The community began to murmur. How could so many women go missing from the same area without any urgency from law enforcement? Was anyone connecting the cases? The truth was, there was a pattern, but no one had put it together. Not yet. At 12,205 Imperial Avenue, a 3-story home with peeling white paint and boarded-up windows stood quiet, unnoticed. It was like any other forgotten house in a struggling neighborhood. A man lived there, mostly keeping to himself. Some knew him as Tony, others called him Sowell. To some he was polite, even friendly. To others he was just another ex-con trying to mind his business. He had been in prison, sure, but lots of people had. Nobody suspected that inside this house, beneath piles of discarded clothes, behind locked doors and in shallow graves, the missing women were still there. The truth is, this story could have ended sooner. In December 2008, Gladys Wade came running into a police station, blood dripping down her face, bruises forming along her body. "He tried to kill me," she gasped. "He dragged me inside. He punched me. He choked me. He tried to rip my clothes off." She told officers that the man who attacked her was Anthony Sowell, a convicted sex offender, just released from a 15-year prison sentence for rape. Sowell was arrested. It should have been the end. But just 2 days later, detectives let him go. They claimed there was insufficient evidence. They said there were no visible injuries. They didn't check his criminal record. They didn't search his house. They didn't know, or didn't care, that they had just set free a serial killer. 2 more women would die that same month. For years, the air around Imperial Avenue reeked of something foul. People complained. They called the city. They covered their noses and hurried past the house where the stench seemed strongest. Some assumed it was a sewer problem. Others pointed fingers at Ray's Sausage, the butcher shop next door. The owners of Ray's Sausage spent thousands cleaning their facility, trying to rid themselves of a smell that wasn't even theirs. But the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. At night, Sowell kept his windows open, as if trying to air something out. But nobody looked too closely. Nobody knew. Not yet. Then came October 29th, 2009. A woman, beaten and naked, fell from the second-story window of 12,205 Imperial Avenue. Police finally entered the house. They weren't ready for what they found inside. Bodies. Bodies everywhere. Some wrapped in plastic, some buried in the backyard, some stuffed into crawl spaces. 11 women, all gone, all forgotten by the system, until now. But who was Anthony Sowell? How did he get away with this for so long? And how many times did police come close to stopping him, but didn't? The world now knew his name, Anthony Sowell, the man whose house held the remains of 11 women, the man whose neighbors had walked past his front door for years, never knowing what lay just beyond the threshold. A serial predator had been hiding in plain sight, and the city of Cleveland was left reeling, asking the same haunting question. How did we miss this? But to truly understand the horrors that unfolded on Imperial Avenue, we have to go back. Back before the bodies, before the disappearances, before the House of Horrors was ever built. Because monsters like Anthony Sowell are not made overnight. Anthony Edward Sowell was born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland, Ohio. He was raised in a home overflowing with children, tension, and suffering. His mother, Claudia Gertrude Garrison, was a single parent, responsible not only for her 7 biological children, but also for 7 of her nieces and nephews, who had moved in after their mother passed away. Imagine a house with 14 children, all packed together in a small, crumbling space. The air was thick with chaos, the walls thin enough to let every scream be heard. Sowell's niece, Leona Davis, would later describe a household ruled by fear. She spoke of beatings so severe that the bruises would linger for weeks. She described a mother who wielded electrical cords like whips and dished out punishments that left permanent scars, both physical and emotional. One incident stood out among the rest. "She made me strip naked in front of everyone," Leona later recounted. "And then she beat me until I bled, until I couldn't stand anymore." Sowell saw this. He grew up watching violence, experiencing it, and eventually participating in it. There was something else too, something darker. Leona Davis later revealed that from the age of 11, she was sexually abused, repeatedly, by her uncle Anthony Sowell. It would go on for 2 years, hidden behind closed doors, unspoken but never forgotten. At 19 years old, Anthony Sowell saw an escape. The United States Marine Corps offered him an alternative to the grim reality of his home life, a chance to leave behind his past and forge a different future. On January 24, 1978, he enlisted, undergoing rigorous training at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Parris Island in South Carolina. From there, he trained as an electrician at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, before being stationed at various bases, including Cherry Point, North Carolina, and eventually Okinawa, Japan. By all accounts, he was a decent Marine. He earned commendations, including a Good Conduct Medal, a Sea Service Deployment Ribbon, and a Meritorious Mast. He was trained in discipline, obedience, in the structure of military life. But beneath the surface, something still festered. Sowell was known to drink excessively, and there were whispers of problematic behavior, though nothing that resulted in serious disciplinary action. For 7 years he served. And then in 1985, he was discharged. Not dishonorably, just quietly let go, as if the military, too, sensed something off about him. For Sowell, there was no triumphant return, no career path, no purpose. He was just another man, back in East Cleveland, a place that had never really changed. And he wasn't the same person who had left. By the time the 1980s drew to a close, Anthony Sowell was 29 years old. And by then, the darkness had already consumed him. It was 1989 when the first documented case of his violent tendencies surfaced. The victim was a pregnant woman, just 3 months along. She knew Sowell. Maybe that's why she didn't think twice when she entered his home. She would later tell police that what happened next felt like a switch being flipped. He was normal until he wasn't, she recalled. Sowell bound her hands and feet, gagged her with a towel, and choked her until her body went numb. I thought I was going to die, she later testified, and she almost did. She barely escaped with her life, running straight to the police. This time they believed her. Sowell was arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, and attempted rape. And yet the punishment he received? A plea deal. Instead of facing the full consequences, he pleaded guilty to attempted rape and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. A slap on the wrist. But a monster like Anthony Sowell doesn't stop, he just waits. For the next 15 years, Sowell lived behind bars. The world outside forgot about him. There were no major incidents in prison, no reports of violence, no warnings that something was brewing beneath the surface. On June 20th, 2005, he was released, a free man. The system assumed he had served his time, paid his debt, and could be reintegrated into society. They were wrong. Because Anthony Sowell wasn't reformed, he was ready. And within months, the murders would begin. In 2005, Sowell moved into 12,205 Imperial Avenue, a house that had once belonged to his father. To the outside world, he was just another ex-con trying to rebuild his life. He found work in a factory for a while. He started dating a woman, Lori Frazier, who would later recall his strange behavior and the unbearable stench that clung to his clothes. He told me it was the sewer, she would later say, or maybe the sausage factory next door. But no one questioned it. No one really looked. And so behind the doors of that decaying house, Anthony Sowell began to hunt. Women started disappearing. At first, no one noticed. But soon, they would. And by then, it would be too late. Imperial Avenue was just another street in Cleveland. People lived their lives, worked their jobs, and went about their daily routines. Children played on sidewalks, neighbors exchanged small talk, and the world moved forward. Unaware that behind the doors of one house, a nightmare was unfolding. It started gradually. A woman would go missing, and there would be no headlines, no police investigations, no widespread searches. Then another, and another. They were whispers in the community, forgotten in the system. But inside 12,205 Imperial Avenue, something was happening. Something so horrific that, even years later, people struggle to comprehend it. Anthony Sowell had been waiting, and now he was ready. Anthony Sowell had perfected his methods. He knew exactly how to find the women he wanted, women who wouldn't be missed, at least not right away. He would walk through the streets of East Cleveland, striking up conversations with women who were homeless, battling addiction, or struggling with mental illness. These women, often dismissed by society, were easy targets. Sowell wasn't a typical predator. He didn't lure his victims by force, at least not at first. Instead, he used something far more deceptive: kindness. He would offer them a drink, a meal, a place to rest. He would pretend to be a friend, a man who understood the struggles of life on the streets. He knew exactly what to say, how to act, how to gain just enough trust to bring them inside. And once they crossed that threshold, once the door to 12,205 Imperial Avenue shut behind them, they never came out again. The first known woman to die inside Sowell's house was Crystal Dozier. A 38-year-old mother of 7, Crystal had battled addiction, but was deeply loved by her family. They knew her struggles, but they also knew one thing for certain: she always kept in touch. Until one day she didn't. Crystal disappeared in May 2007. Her mother, Florence Bray, immediately sensed something was wrong. She reported Crystal missing, pleaded with the police to investigate. But the response? "She'll turn up," they told her. "She's probably out somewhere." Weeks turned into months. The family put up flyers, searched the streets, and tried to piece together what had happened. But there were no leads, no evidence, no answers. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Crystal was already gone. Sowell had strangled her to death inside his house. When her body went still, he simply kept it there. He didn't rush to dispose of it. He didn't panic. He let it sit. After Crystal, the murders became more frequent. By 2008, The house had already claimed multiple victims. Women entered, never to be seen again. The smell in the neighborhood grew stronger. And yet, no one connected the dots. No one suspected that a serial killer was actively hunting in their midst. His next known victim was Tonya Carmichael, a 52-year-old woman who vanished in December 2008. Like Crystal, Tonya had a history of addiction. Like Crystal, her family reported her missing. And like Crystal, she was never found alive. Sowell had developed a pattern. He strangled his victims, sometimes using his bare hands, sometimes using cords or fabric. He kept their bodies inside his home, sometimes for weeks, before eventually moving them to the basement, the crawl spaces, or even shallow graves in the backyard. But the bodies weren't the only things left behind. The stench of death was seeping into the walls, creeping out onto the street, and people were noticing. By mid-2009, the stench of rotting flesh had become impossible to ignore. People living nearby had complained for years, believing the smell was coming from Ray's Sausage, the butcher shop next door. Ray's Sausage spent thousands of dollars cleaning and sanitizing their facility, trying to rid themselves of the accusations. But the smell never went away, because the source of it wasn't their shop. It was the house next door. 12,205 Imperial Avenue. People were holding their breath when they walked past. Some had even started avoiding the sidewalk near the house altogether. But still, no one investigated. No one knocked on the door. No one dared to ask what was inside. And so, the killing continued. In September 2009, everything changed. A woman, her name remains undisclosed for privacy reasons, entered Sowell's house, accepting his invitation for a drink. But once inside, the atmosphere shifted. Sowell turned violent fast. He punched her in the face, choked her, and forced her onto the floor. She struggled, fighting for her life, managing to claw at his arms and break free. And then she ran. She ran out of the house, out into the street, half naked and covered in bruises. This time, someone listened. This time, police were called. And for the first time, officers entered 12,205 Imperial Avenue. They were about to stumble upon something out of a horror film. The officers were not prepared for what they were about to witness. The moment they stepped inside, the smell hit them first. A thick, suffocating wave of rot and decay. They moved through the house, checking room after room, and then they saw it. A skull, wrapped in a paper bag, sitting in the corner of the basement. Then a body beneath a pile of trash. And then, in the backyard, more bodies. The nightmare was real. 11 women, 11 lives, and one man responsible. The doors of 12,205 Imperial Avenue had finally been opened. Inside, officers had uncovered a reality more horrifying than they could have imagined. The stench that had plagued the neighborhood for years had a source they had ignored, dismissed, and walked past time and time again. 11 bodies, 11 women whose lives were stolen by a man who should have never been free to kill. But how did Anthony Sowell get away with this for so long? How did a known sex offender with a violent past manage to turn his home into a personal graveyard, all while the world around him remained blind? The answer was simple. He was allowed to. When police finally arrested Anthony Sowell on October 31st, 2009, it wasn't because of the missing women. It wasn't because of the complaints about the smell. It was because of the woman who escaped, the one who fought back, ran out of the house, and refused to be ignored. Had it not been for her, Sowell might never have been caught. But what makes this case even more chilling isn't just the brutality of his crimes. It's the fact that he could have been stopped years earlier. Let's go back to December 2008, almost a year before the discovery of the bodies. A woman named Gladys Wade walked into a Cleveland police station, her face swollen and bruised. "He tried to kill me," she told officers. "He dragged me inside, punched me, choked me. He was trying to rape me." She named her attacker, Anthony Sowell. This wasn't just any man. This was a registered sex offender, a man who had served 15 years in prison for an eerily similar crime. Police arrested him. They had him in custody, and then just 2 days later, they let him go. Why? Because there were no visible injuries. Because they said there wasn't enough evidence. Because no one bothered to investigate further. And so Sowell walked free. By the time he was finally arrested in October 2009, 2 more women were dead. How many lives could have been saved if authorities had just listened? After his arrest, police wasted no time conducting a full search of 12,205 Imperial Avenue. What they found was beyond comprehension. Bodies buried in shallow graves in the backyard, stuffed into crawl spaces, rotting beneath piles of garbage. Some had been there for years, decomposing inside a house that should have been a crime scene long ago. And then, there were the remnants of violence. Blood-stained mattresses, ropes, extension cords used as restraints. But one of the most horrifying discoveries was the way Sowell lived among his victims. He never left the house. He never tried to hide the smell. Instead, he slept next to their corpses, let them decay around him, and carried on as if nothing was wrong. His home was not just a killing ground, it was his trophy case. The autopsies confirmed what many feared. All of the women had been strangled to death. Some showed signs of brutal beatings before they died. Others had been bound and left helpless as they awaited their fate. Forensic teams uncovered DNA evidence, personal belongings, and signs that many of the victims had fought for their lives. But no one heard their screams. No one came for them. With overwhelming evidence against him, Sowell had nowhere to run. Investigators sat across from him in the interrogation room, ready to break him down. But Anthony Sowell wasn't like other serial killers. He didn't gloat. He didn't brag. Instead, he played the victim. "I don't know how they got there," he told detectives. "I'm not a monster. I didn't do anything wrong." It was textbook manipulation. He claimed that some of the women had died naturally in his home and that he had been too afraid to call the police. Detectives pressed harder. "So why didn't you stop after the first one? Why were some of them buried? Why were they hidden?" Sowell had no answers. He sat there shifting in his seat, struggling to maintain his lies. And then finally he gave them something chilling. "I didn't plan it," he said. "It just happened." For Anthony Sowell, murder was casual. For him, taking a life was as routine as breathing. When the truth about Sowell's crimes came out, Cleveland erupted in outrage. Protests took place outside the courthouse. Families of the victims demanded answers. How had a man like this been allowed to roam free? How had law enforcement ignored the warnings? Why did it take 11 deaths before someone finally stopped him? It was more than just a failure of policing. It was a failure of an entire system, a system that didn't care enough to search for women who were poor, struggling, or addicted. Had these women been from different backgrounds? Had they been wealthier? Had they lived in a different neighborhood? Would they have been saved? These were the questions the city was now forced to face. But one thing was certain. Anthony Sowell was done hunting, and now it was his turn to face judgment. For years, Anthony Sowell prowled the streets of Cleveland, luring vulnerable women into his home and silencing them forever. 11 bodies were found, 11 lives stolen, and for every victim discovered, one question remained. How many more were never found? Now, with Sowell finally in custody, the fight for justice was about to begin. But as his trial loomed, one thing became clear. This case would not be simple, and for the families of the victims, justice would come at a painful price. As the news of Sowell's arrest spread, Cleveland erupted in outrage. The families of the victims were angry, heartbroken, and exhausted. Many had reported their loved ones missing years earlier, only to be ignored. Now they wanted justice. Crowds gathered outside the Cuyahoga County Courthouse, holding signs with the names of the women Sowell had taken. They weren't just headlines. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, and friends. "The police failed us. The city failed us. This never should have happened." Inside the courtroom, prosecutors were preparing for what would become one of the most high-profile cases in Cleveland history. Sowell was charged with 11 counts of aggravated murder, 74 additional counts of rape, kidnapping, and corpse abuse. It was overwhelming. The evidence against him was stacked high, and yet, Sowell refused to plead guilty. Instead, he sat in court with the same detached expression he had worn during his interrogation. Unmoved, unbothered. And then the trial began. On June 6, 2011, Nearly 2 years after his arrest, jury selection for Anthony Sowell's trial commenced. But even before the first witness was called, problems arose. Sowell's defense team argued that he could not receive a fair trial in Cleveland. The media coverage had been too intense, they said. The public had already convicted him in their minds. Prosecutors fought back. What about the victims, they argued? What about their families who waited years for justice? The judge refused to move the trial. Cleveland would bear witness to what had happened within its own city. And so the prosecution began presenting their case. One by one, they laid out the horrors that unfolded inside 12,205 Imperial Avenue. They showed the crime scene photos, images so disturbing that some jurors had to look away. They brought in forensic experts who described how each victim had died. They recounted the autopsies, detailing the strangulation marks, the signs of torture, the decomposition, the smell, the suffocating presence of death inside that house. And then the witnesses took the stand. The most powerful testimony came from the women who lived to tell their stories.
You could see the demon, the devil from the pit of hell. There's bodies in the wall, in the backyard, in the basement. You got a head in a bucket. On allowing me to leave the first time. And we're talking about somebody that had been drinking all night, which I have a high tolerance for alcohol, because that was my number one drug of choice, was alcohol. Because you're gonna sit up all night and feed some woman drinks, drugs, cigarettes, and I guess he was waiting on me and I was sober as a judge. So he was waiting for that to kick in. When that didn't kick in, he went to plan B. Because he had let me walk out the door, he got mad at himself, because that was not his intentions, is to let me go at all. So when I came back for my ID, he saw his opportunity to hurt yet another woman. Had I not gone back for that ID, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
One survivor, her voice shaking, described the moment Sowell turned violent. One minute, he was nice. The next, I was on the ground and he was squeezing my throat. Another recounted how she barely escaped with her life, fighting him off and running half naked into the street. I kept thinking, if I stop running, I die. Their words pierced the courtroom. Even the jurors, who had prepared for the worst, were visibly disturbed. The prosecution had painted a picture of a remorseless predator, a man who thrived on control, fear, and death. And then it was the defense's turn to respond. Sowell's attorneys knew they couldn't argue innocence. The DNA evidence, the bodies, the survivors' testimonies, it was all too much to refute. So they tried a different strategy. They painted Sowell as a damaged man, shaped by a childhood of abuse, a military career that left him broken, and years of untreated mental illness. He is not a monster, they told the jury. He is a product of trauma, a man who spiraled out of control. They claimed that Sowell suffered from brain damage, that he had post-traumatic stress disorder, that he was incapable of controlling his violent impulses. But the prosecution tore these arguments apart. This is not about trauma. This is about choice. He chose to kill, again and again. He showed no remorse. He lived among his victims. He did this because he wanted to. The jury listened. They watched Sowell sit motionless, staring at the table, never looking at the families of the women he murdered. And then, after 15 hours of deliberation, they made their decision. On July 22, 2011, Anthony Sowell was found guilty on all 83 counts. The room was silent as the judge read the verdict. The families of the victims gripped each other's hands, some crying, some staring straight ahead. And Sowell? He didn't react. No emotion, no remorse, just nothing. But the trial wasn't over yet. Now came the sentencing phase. Would Sowell receive life in prison or the death penalty? On August 10, 2011, the jury recommended the death penalty. 2 days later, Judge Dick Ambrose upheld that decision. "You are a vile predator," he told Sowell. "The world will be better without you in it." For the first time since his arrest, Sowell spoke. "I'm sorry," he muttered. But it was too late. The families of the victims finally had justice. But no sentence could bring back the women who were lost. And for Cleveland, the scars of this case would never fully heal. Anthony Sowell was a convicted killer, a predator, a man who had hunted, tortured, and murdered 11 women before his reign of terror finally ended. He sat in a courtroom, his fate sealed, the gavel falling like the final breath of the victims he had stolen. The jury had spoken. The judge had declared it. Death. For the families of the women lost, there was relief. Justice, in its cold and unforgiving form, had been served. But the echoes of Sowell's crimes would not fade so easily. His story did not end with a single verdict. The scars he left on Cleveland, on the survivors, and on the families of his victims would never fully heal. And even as he was sentenced to die, Anthony Sowell wasn't finished causing pain. With Sowell behind bars, Cleveland was forced to face a terrible reality. This case had never been just about one man's crimes. It was about a system that had failed, time and time again. For years, the disappearances of women in the Imperial Avenue neighborhood were ignored. When families reported their loved ones missing, police dismissed their concerns because of their backgrounds, because of their struggles, because of who they were. If the police had listened when these women went missing, they would have stopped him after the first murder, one victim's family member later said. And it was true. The warning signs had been there. The neighbors complaining about the smell, the multiple reports of women being attacked in Sowell's home, the failed arrests and missed opportunities to search his house. Had Sowell's victims been wealthy, white, from a different part of the city? Would it have taken 11 bodies for someone to take action? Cleveland had to confront those hard questions. The police department came under fire, accused of negligence. Officers were questioned about why they failed to take reports seriously, why the signs of a serial killer were overlooked for years. For many families, the trial was not just about Sowell, but about making sure this never happened again. Following his sentencing, Anthony Sowell was transferred to Ohio's death row, where he awaited execution. Locked away in Chillicothe Correctional Institution, he spent his days alone in a small cell, isolated from other inmates. For a man who had thrived on control, who had taken pleasure in trapping women inside his home, it was a fitting fate. Now he was the one who could not escape. But even behind bars, Sowell fought to save his own life. His defense attorneys filed appeal after appeal, arguing that his trial had been unfairly biased due to media coverage. He had suffered brain damage from childhood abuse and military service. His background of trauma should have spared him from execution. The courts rejected these arguments one by one. But the truth was, Ohio's death penalty system was slow. Years passed and Sowell remained alive. For the families of his victims, it was a bitter reality. "My sister didn't get years to fight for her life," one family member said. "Why should he?" By 2020, Anthony Sowell had been sitting on death row for nearly a decade. His execution date had not yet been set. Then in January 2021, the world was still in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic. Inside Ohio's prisons, the virus spread quickly, infecting inmates and staff alike. And Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, the man who had evaded justice for years, who had stolen the lives of 11 women, became just another statistic. On February 8, 2021, Sowell died from a terminal illness at the age of 61. There was no final execution, no last meal, no final statement to the families of his victims. He died alone in a prison hospital bed, far from the home where he had committed his horrors. For some, it was a disappointment. They wanted to see him executed, wanted him to feel the fear his victims had felt in their last moments. For others, it was a quiet, anticlimactic end to a nightmare that had already stretched on for too long. "He got to die in a hospital," one victim's family member said. "That's better than what he gave them." But the question remained, had justice really been served? Long after Sowell was gone, his legacy of terror remained. His house, the site of his crimes, was demolished in 2011, just months after his conviction. What once stood as a house of horrors became an empty lot, a space filled with painful memories but no physical trace of what had happened there. Yet for the families, the demolition didn't erase the pain. Some tried to move forward. Others struggled, unable to forget the way the city had failed their loved ones. But there was change. In the years that followed Sowell's arrest, Cleveland reformed its missing persons policies. Police were required to take reports more seriously, to act faster when people disappeared, regardless of their backgrounds, addictions, or struggles. It was too late for the women of Imperial Avenue. But maybe, just maybe, it would save someone else. The story of Anthony Sowell isn't just a true crime case. It's a warning. It's a story about the evil that can hide in plain sight, the victims society ignores, and the cost of looking the other way. The women he took weren't nameless. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, friends. And while their names may have been forgotten for too long, they will never be forgotten again. This case is over, but the lessons it left behind will last forever. If you found this story as haunting and heartbreaking as we did, make sure to like this video, subscribe to True Crime Watch HD, and hit the notification bell. But more importantly, let's keep this conversation going. What do you think? Did Sowell's death cheat the families out of justice? Could the police have stopped him sooner? And how can we, as a society, do better to protect those most vulnerable? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this, they should never be forgotten.